Hi everybody, I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie,
Hello.
and together we are ThinkerThemer, and we review games from two different perspectives. I'm all about the mechanics and Maggie is all about the theme. Now, you may notice that our studio looks a little bit different. We're making some much needed upgrades to our studio, so bear with us while we have no lighting and everything, but we do have these beautiful postcards that you all sent us, so thank you very much. But today we're very excited to be previewing for you Brink by Ivy Studio and designers Max Anderson, Zach Dixon, and Austin Harrison. Now, please remember this is a prototype, so all of the rules and components are subject to change, but let's get into it.
So in Brink, we find ourselves back in the Moonraker's universe, where we're going to be sending out our ships to explore the galaxy. We're going to be collecting different resources to either use ourselves or trade with our rivals. And we're also, quite importantly, going to be trying to align ourselves with different factions so that at the time of the council vote, we want to try and use our influence to make sure that the factions that we have aligned ourselves with come out on top.
Now, this game takes place over 3 rounds, and in each of those rounds, you're going to be placing your 3 ships. And so you have a Class 1, a Class 2, and a Class 3 ship. And they are going to be placed out onto this universe that's represented by hexes that already exist and new hexes that you're going to reveal as you explore and find new resources and new action placement spots. Now, the interesting thing about this game is the way that these ships activate the hexes that exist in the galaxy. And the reason is that the small ships only activate a single hex. So for example, if I placed my Class 1 ship onto this hex, I would get to take this single action that's represented by this icon and pick up these 2 resources, 2 blue resources. Now, a couple of things about the resources. If they do not have a white border around them, so they just look like this that you can see here, they are called influence, and those are resources that I'm going to collect, and then I'm simply going to put into my supply, which sits behind one of these cardboard barriers so that my opponents cannot see the number or type of influence that I have. However, if I were to place my ship instead on this hex, I would also get 2 resources, but they are not called influence. Now they're called favors, and that's because there's a white border around these resources, and that means that they are not mine to keep. So even though I've picked up these 2 purple resources, which are really great because actually they act as a wild, they're going to go to the front of my tray, and at the end of my turn I need to trade those away with other players around the table. If I don't trade them away, they are simply going to be discarded back into the supply. So it's in my best interest to get the best deal as possible for these 2 purple favors so that I'm making the most of my turn. Now, as we move to the larger ship, so my Class 2 ship, this actually sits between 2 hexes, and now I get to collect both of these resources. Likewise, if I have my Class 3 ship, it gets to activate the 3 hexes that it's sitting across, and only one player can occupy these positions on these tiles. Now, it doesn't just dictate which resources you're picking up and whether they're influence or favors, but also which actions you get to take that are to do with things that you can see across the board. So one of these actions is to actually upgrade your ships. And so that's very exciting because everybody has this own ship upgrade path connected to their player board. And if you pay these resources on either the left or right hand track, you choose which way you move this marker up to unlock different types of upgrades. There are 2 different types of upgrades. One is cargo and one is a railgun, and both of them actually clip into your ship and attach so that you can see that it now has that upgrade. The cargo allows that ship to collect twice as many resources when it's out in the galaxy. Whereas if you were to equip a railgun instead, it gives you +1 power in the position that you occupy on the map. What is power? Power in this game is the way that you're going to align yourselves with different factions, and at the end of every round, all players are going to contribute to a vote that is going to determine what score each of those factions is going to give at the end of the round. And this scoring is really important, and the way that you get influence or power is dependent on where your ships are placed on the map and the borders that they're touching. There are 4 key factions in in the game that you're trying to align yourself with, and we exclude this utopian alliance which comes into the game in other ways. But what you're looking at is where your ship is based and the colored borders that it's touching. For example, my class 2 ship is currently worth 1 power in blue and 1 power in yellow, whereas my class 3 ship is worth 1 in orange and 1 in green because the utopian alliance doesn't count. And so at the end of the round, what you're going to do is players are all going to secretly place the influence that they've collected onto this little removable tray. And they're going to put the votes on the faction that they want to come out on top. We reveal the votes simultaneously, and then the faction that gained the most votes is going to be worth in round 1 3 points per power that you have on the map, and then whichever color comes second is going to get 2 points per power that you have on the map. Any color that is not represented here is not going to score. So it's really important that you keep an eye on what everybody else is doing around the table and the resources that they have available to them to predict what you think is going to score in that round. So you can see why the railgun becomes really important to add additional power to that faction, but also there are hexes in this random distribution of hexes that you're going to be revealing. Some of those have a double border and they are worth double the amount of power when you have a ship that is adjacent to it. So now let's talk about a couple of the other actions that you can do in this game. So one of the actions is to play a rider card. Now you always have 2 to choose from because you start the game with 1 rider card, and then when you take this action you're going to draw 1 and compare the 2 and play 1 down here publicly, because rider cards influence the vote and they influence it for everybody. So you get to choose a faction that the rule applies to, and that's going to have some influence over the council vote at the end of the round. Now there are only 2 other actions in this game. One is the ambassador action, which allows you to purchase one of these ambassador cards that are going to give you an ongoing benefit throughout the game, but they're also a little set collection game as well. You want diversity of ambassador color, and that's going to give you victory points at the end of the game. But the interesting thing is when you purchase them, you spend resources or influence from behind your screen, but you can also combine that with the power that you currently have and the hexes in the galaxy to be able to reduce the price of that card cost. And the final action you can take is you can go to this action card action. Now everyone wants to collect action cards. Why? Because they have cool powers. They are going to allow you to influence the vote at the end of the round. They might have little goodies on them, such as allowing you to discard the card in order to take an extra turn of some type. But it's also worth noting that instead of taking the action shown on the tiles, you can also use that action to collect resources by way of favors that you can then use to trade with other people and get the influence that you need. Finally, at any time on your turn, if you've saved up enough power and influence, you can spend it to grab one of these faction cards. And this is a first in, best dressed situation where only the first person to get it gets to keep it for the rest of the game. And a lot of these unlock different components of the game that affect not only you, but the other players in the game as well. So that's mostly how the game works, but how do we feel about it? Starting with the theme, because this game actually looks a bit like a 4X game, but it doesn't play like that really.
Yeah, it actually does feel more like an abstract color puzzle than it does like exploration and going to a different area. It's really, you know, as you're sending your ships out, and it's more like a ship landing because you don't ever really move
like
around.
Worker placement action.
Yeah, it's very much a ship placement type game, but you don't really ever take. I think there's like one element where you can move one hex. That happens sort of rarely. You're not really moving around. You're really just like landing them, landing each ship once per round, and you do that 3 times, and then that's the game.
Yeah. And now the game is set in the Moonraker's universe. We have actually only played Moonrakers once, so I'm sorry if you're looking for an in-depth comparison, but because it's set in that universe, I think people would want to know that if you have never played Moonrakers, what does the theme make sense? It's pretty light in terms of theme.
Yeah, thematically it's fairly, like, again, it plays out fairly abstractly. So if you don't know Moonrakers, it won't really affect. I think the thing that felt the most like it's just the negotiation. So this is very much a high interaction. This is not like, I'm just going to play my own little game thing. Like, no, and the game itself moves you in that direction because there's quite a number of hexes and areas where the resources that you're gaining, you can't keep. So I like that you don't have the option to keep them.
I
because
love
often
that about
it
the
is
game.
just forcing that interaction. And I don't usually enjoy interaction, but in this case, it's not really, it's like, well, if you want something, because you can't keep those ones. It's like, well, I've got these two very powerful wild. Who can give me anything? Literally anything. And so, yeah, I enjoy that.
This game, and it is very abstract in, the way it plays, and it's not heavy on thematic language.
No.
And so that means that it's easy to get into. So you're not tripping up on a lot of thematic language. But I think that that is by design, because by keeping everything very minimalistic, very simple, this game exists in table talk. If you are going to enjoy this game, the main thing we can ask you as to whether this will suit you or not is, do you like interaction? Do you like negotiation? Because this has all of the most fun elements of negotiation. When, as Maggie says, you get a couple of resources, you cannot keep them. So you need to do your best and you need to hear everybody out. And that's what drags the game out in terms of game length as well, but in the most fun way, because you're like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe. Can you do any better? Can you do any better around the table, waiting to get that best offer and making the trade? And then you start to form alliances and you start to say, if you do this trade with me right now, later on in the game, I definitely will trade with you later. But you don't have to keep those promises.
Yeah. There's a lot of favor, sort of favor lay by, where you go, I'm just gonna hold this, because often the trade that you're making at that point is going to be suboptimal. Sometimes the resources are kind of scarce, or it's interesting that the areas that you end up having power in don't usually give you the resource that you need to make the voting in that area more powerful.
Correct.
So if I go into an area and I'm all of a sudden I've got power in green, the resource that I'm getting is yellow, and so I'm like, okay, well now I have to find a way of getting green resources or making some kind of trade to either get wilds, because you're never going to be able to just get them for yourself. You're going to have to have them as part of trade, or convince someone else to vote green or to go to a green sort of area.
Yeah, and when you're the person who's trying to negotiate away these favors, you're not in a position of power, because everybody around the table knows that if you don't make a deal, they're going back into the supply. And so you're in this desperation mode of, I need to get something, and then someone offers you just one thing for this collection of resources, and then you have to decide, do you just want to not take it out of spite? Because that is a bad deal. So if you enjoy negotiation, this game is certainly going to scratch the same itch as Moonraker's does, because that one time we played it, that certainly it was what shone through, was the table talk and the negotiation. Now, if negotiation is not your thing, if your friendship group have a habit of ganging up on people.
King making, queen
making, or just, aligning with, couples aligning with each other. Whatever the dynamic is, that will probably play out in this game because of the way you're incentivized. And it's really interesting, because if people are willing to work with each other and everything is a free-for-all, then you start to get these interesting round by round, kind of alliances of, you and I both have a lot of blue power. We really want to push this blue vote through. So let's help each other. And then you start to make these little deals, and that's really interesting. But if you are with a group of people who, they know that someone always wins, or
there could be some embargoes happening. Going, don't trade with Amy. Don't let Amy have.
I definitely found, as the person teaching this game, that people were therefore I'm not going to trade with you.
There's an assumed competence, but it's actually correct most of the time. So I feel like that's where that kind of happens. You're like, oh, I won again. It's like,
But then, by the same token, one of our friends, who is just so kind and nice, kept making these deals, and we, 3/4 of the way through a game, we would realize that he was getting all these resources because no one found him threatening. So everyone was like, oh yeah, of course, I'll do that with him. And so anyway, you can see by the way that we're talking about it that, this game does exist, again, above the game, around the table, and it's going to be very group dependent. So just bear that in mind if you're thinking about whether this is a game for you or not.
Now, another thing that I really enjoy about this is the actual puzzle of when you're deciding what area to go to and what section to explore and how many more hexes to try and expand into, is that there's multiple decisions going on at once. It's not just, what color do I want to align myself with? There's the color that you're going to then have power in, which will be very, very key in terms of when that end of round happens, and that, you know, which faction comes first, second. A lot of the points are going to come from that multiplier there. But then there's also the what color resource am I going to get, because I'm going to need that for voting. That's going to determine that you know, who comes up first or second, and who's not going to get any points from that. But then there's also the, well, what action am I wanting to take? So there's those 3 layers of decision that you're making in just every one move, which I found that really made it quite engaging for me and quite interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, very layered. There's lots of counting in your head when you're trying to work out, okay, wait, how much power do I have versus this color versus that color?
Yeah.
But also the game is quite dynamic in that someone can take the spot that you were wanting to take, and then you have to reassess your options. So it's really interesting, and to me, in my mind, it does kind of play out a bit like a worker placement game. I'm going to keep saying that, but that's the feeling that it gives me, because I'm thinking about what action and resources and power do I want every time I place one of my ships. And you only get to place your ships 9 times in this game, in the whole game. So you are really limited across the 3 rounds, and you need to be really careful about what you're doing, but you also need to be really head up about what the other players are doing. If someone has a lot of power in one color, orange for example, you might want to think about getting in on that action, because you're like, well, they're going to be voting for orange.
You're going to be invested in that.
Exactly. And I've got some orange influence, maybe I'll jump on board with that. So it's a kind of influx, which I really like about the game.
The other layer that I really like is actually the ship upgrades. So the ship upgrades also have that bit of a decision of going, oh, you know, do I want to go for cargo? And it's actually quite tricky to get all the way up, and each one of the levels, each layer is only going to apply to your, you know, subsequent level ship. So the first layer that I unlock is only going to be for my level 1 ship, and then if I move to the next, and then the next is going to be able to give me the other ones. But that whole decision between, do I want to make it more powerful in terms of that cargo and get more resources that I can either use for voting or hopefully trade, or adding that the extra power, which can, it sort of sounds like not that much, but it can make a huge difference, because again, of those multipliers, sometimes like in the second and third rounds, if it comes first, that's every one of those powers is a times 4 points. So that can be quite intense.
Yeah, and there are some other really powerful ways to get points in this game. But I think what's interesting is that you really can't do it all. You need to focus your strategy. So for example, if you want to upgrade your ships, the other great thing about making your way all the way up this track, and you need to, in the prototype at least, go 6 spaces out of 9 turns. So you need to be activating an upgrade action, you know, 2/3 of the time in this game. But if you get all the way to the top of this track, it is worth 15 victory points at the end of the game. Likewise, if you can collect all of the different colored cards from the ambassador cards, you're also going to get 18 points at the end of the game. And so these are great things to be doing, but they cost so many actions in order to get there, not to mention the resources or influence that you need to pay along the way. So you just can't do everything. So you need to focus on a strategy, and it was really interesting to watch our friends all focus on something slightly different. And then there are these faction cards, these abilities that you can activate that change the game slightly. I won't go into them in too much detail, but for example, if you aligned yourself with this purple faction, again, we're not connected with this theme, but if you align yourself with this purple faction, Sorelia, this purple faction is interesting because these resources, when you vote, these wild resources, they can go on any color, but they're worth 2 influence instead of 1. So your regular colored cubes are only worth 1. These are worth 2. If you are the person to unlock this card and have it in front of you, well, these cubes are actually worth 3 influence to you now. So you can see how that could be really powerful. Likewise, I really like this UA trade agreement blue card. If you have that in front of you, you unlock this new type of UA resource, which are those red crosses that you can see over there. When those are placed in a vote, they are worth -2 influence for that color that you've voted on. So you can really mess with the other players.
Cancelling out other potentially powerful voters.
Yes. Plus, once they're unlocked, those resources now get placed onto the Utopian Alliance spaces on the board. So if the other players want to collect them, they can, land adjacent to that particular space and pick them up and collect them. So it kind of changes the game dynamic. So those are really interesting, but the reality is you're probably only going to unlock one or two of those per game because they are expensive and they take a while. You're not going to unlock that until the second round. So you have to weigh up, is this going to be the best use of my resources?
Getting resources is quite a struggle. It's not super abundant in resources, so they're quite precious as they're coming. I really like the fact that also the tension, I feel like for me, the tension in the puzzle of this game is that often the action that you want to try and do is rarely the color that you want to try and be aligned with, and it's rarely the type of resource that you're wanting to get. So it's always like you're just that little bit far away going, oh, but I need to do this. And so it's those compromises that you're having to make along the way. Also, this whole thing of like whenever you're upgrading your ship with this red Utopian Alliance, that gives you no power. So that you're always then compromising. If you had gone anywhere else, then you'd be in for the voting kind of power point. But so it's like, do I make my ships more powerful at the expense of not being able to? Yeah, I really enjoy that tension.
Yeah, and then suddenly someone will play the rider action, and that's really interesting as well because the rider action is going to play cards that influence the way the voting works. And some of those, for example, might give you a benefit or reward for voting for a certain color. And that's really interesting because then all of a sudden everybody is incentivized to vote for yellow. And so then you're thinking, do I have enough yellow? Because that's probably going to be a vote that gets pushed through. So that's really interesting as well.
Another interesting element of this is you have this sort of resource shakedown where depending on the player count, there's a limited number of resources for each color that are available. And if at any point a particular color has been depleted and someone needs to gain that color, there's a bit of a shakedown where everyone has to forego that color half rounded up. And so that prevents any one or two players from just hoarding and completely controlling any one color. But it also can be so frustrating in the best possible way because you're like, oh no, like that. We know that that's about to vote, and I was so powerful, like I had such a powerful position in that element, and now I'm having to forego so much of that. So that's interesting. The other thing is the variability that with the game in terms of having these action cards and the rider cards, because obviously there's quite a lot of different ones of them. It just, for me, it kind of made the game feel quite different. Like every round you have different sets of conditions that the rider cards are adding to the voting, or things that, as you said, like are going to be more powerful potentially, and so everyone's incentivized. And so that from game to game made it feel like I'm not always just kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah, but ultimately the variability in this game comes from the people that you're playing with, because some of them are going to be generous traders and others are going to keep all of their resources and hoard them away and not trade anything. Yeah. And so the dynamics again is really the key to this game. But before we get into just our final thoughts on who this game is for, we'll talk about player count just briefly, because unfortunately we didn't get sent the 2-player component. So we haven't had a chance to play this at 2 players. When you do play 2 players, you will have a new rival. The rival is interesting. It's a set of cards, but it's also a bag of resources, and you are going to be able to trade with this rival on your turn instead of just with each other. But when you are trading with this rival, you are contributing a particular color into their bag, and their bag is going to be drawn from to influence the vote. So in a way, you're kind of mitigating the randomness of this third player. Yeah. So that's really interesting. Yeah, but we haven't had a chance to try that out, but we have played it at 3 to 5 players. And in this game, it is a game that is going to be better with more players. It's just because it's about negotiation. The hexes get more filled up. There's more dynamics going on. And that is really the spirit of this game. So in summary, is this game for you? It all comes down to the negotiation element. For us, for our taste, I do think it swings a little bit hard into the negotiation territory, which isn't our preferred style of game. In terms of Moonrakers versus this, Moonrakers, I would say, I feel like it's a little bit heavier, a little more meat
Yes.
on the bones.
Yeah,
and
I
for
agree.
that reason, I'm probably oriented a little bit more towards that. Just because this is quite a simple game, in fact. While there's lots of interesting dynamics going on, and why I understand why they kept it simple so that we can focus on the table talk, that's essentially what this is. A game that enables those hilarious moments of trade between you and your friends. So we hope you enjoyed this preview. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now. Bye.